I feel like a lot of Christians are stuck, and I would just kind of say this, stuck between a rock and a hard place where we don't really like the music of the present, whether it's pop music or contemporary worship music or postmodern high art music. There's not a lot there for us. We don't feel like we're kind of at ends with current music, but we also feel kind of disconnected from the music of the past. And I'd like to, I don't know if there's anything that you could, if I were to pose that question to you, is there anything you could say about like how to move forward? Like people ask me, I want to buy a CD. What do I buy? It seems like such an elementary question. But even like, is it worthwhile listening to old music, classical music? What's there for us? Should I care about it? Like not necessarily where do I start? Like start by listening to Bach. But like a word of encouragement for Christians who want to do Colossians 3 and to admonish one another with psalms and hymns and have it be a musical thing. Is there if I were to kind of pose that and walk us into that, is there something you could say about that?
Well, yeah, because I think music needs to be cultivated. And cultivation is something that happens upon you, or you can take initiative. But cultivation usually is, you think about planting a garden, and something that I do not like to do. And my father was an organic gardener, and he loved it. And he loved to get out there and just pick the weeds out of it and cultivate it. And he had a beautiful garden that always came up with beautiful fruit. That was a lot of work. And it was going against the weeds and going against the soil, and you have to cut against things to cultivate beautiful things. Now, if you just are passive, there is going to be a culture that acts upon you. And yet, I encourage people to listen to good things, even if they don't like it. We've had people come to our church and say, well, I don't really much like to sing the Psalms. And, well, we need to have some cultivation. You've probably never been used to it. You've probably never heard it before. And there's something not wrong with the Psalms, obviously, but there's something wrong with us, and we have to be cultivated. So even with my children, we require certain things. They like to listen to different kinds of music, but on Saturday, it's all preparation for the Lord's Day, and we require them to listen to some form of sacred music or sacred text or some music of that. And they can listen Monday through Friday of different things, but for Saturday's preparation, and on the Lord's Day, even in the high form of sacred music. And yet, so there's a cultivation that goes on. Why should we listen to things of the past? Because we've often neglected our fathers. And as the Bible says, we're not to move the landmarks of our fathers. And today we often have a throwing out of the conventions of the past in order to be novel or something new or creative or inventive. And yet we have to stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before us. And I believe very fundamentally that if you're writing music and you're not writing it deliberately and standing on the shoulders of those of the past, your music will not last for a generation. It will not be transcendent. Because we have to have what the development of what our fathers have given us, and we take these things and we go back and learn what this is when polyphony first entered the world, and from the plain song chant, and now we're in 2 voices and 4 voices, and that's beginning to be developed even further into this counterpoint that is in the 16th century had great impact upon the people around it, and the church particularly, and understanding those conventions even. So yes, there's a lot of folks that have not grown up with music, so they are consumers of the products around them that they like. And even that may have been cultivated because their friends listen to that music or this music, and they just, that's what they know. And so they enjoy what they're familiar with. But they haven't been stretched. And yet at the same time, I find that as I have grown older, my musical tastes have changed. They've been more refined and developed. And the more I understand about music, the more refined they become, and the more I find myself going back to the 16th century or to the 18th century, or to certain, and I'm growing from those things and now appreciating even more music of our day and setting as it has been founded in some of those conventions of the past. So yeah, I believe that not only should we be listening to older forms of music and maybe those that we don't even enjoy, to learn something from them, but to also learn to appreciate them in and of the high art it is of itself. I was just recently watching a documentary on sacred music with Harry Christophers, who directs the 16 choir. And here's this very high form of choir that is singing medieval and Baroque music. They specialize in that. And so I back up and think, if someone of that high degree and of that high study in the form of music finds something very powerful and attractive to something that my ears just did not care for, perhaps I'm missing something, and I need to see what is that. And so then placing yourself back in the context of a 12th century church when polyphony first was introduced into the time of the liturgy, it gives you a different perspective. And there's a beauty there that I didn't otherwise appreciate.
It sounds like what you're describing, Marion, is a mix of boldness to go back and to explore music that perhaps you didn't grow up with, or that we didn't listen to as a teenager, or that we didn't get from our parents. And that takes a certain amount of willingness to embrace something new and different. But also with that boldness, would it be fair to say a certain amount of humility to accept that maybe our tastes do need to be cultivated and refined? I like that word, cultivated.
And I think humility is the key. When we're humble, we're teachable. And when we're not, we want to just do it our way or have it our way, and we don't think we need to be taught. And humility is acting in posturing ourselves to be taught by something we otherwise would not have been taught by, or to go in an area we would otherwise not have gone, or to be trained by some place or somebody or a genre that we otherwise wouldn't have cared for.
Give me an example of a way that your taste has changed, something that you used to enjoy or look forward to, maybe Friday night, I'm gonna listen to this or that, the other thing, and how that's changed.
Well, I grew up in a very musical home, and always heard my sisters plunking away on the piano with Bach, and we always had classical music playing in the background.
You were one of those kids.
I was one of those kids. And my father was a minister, and in a couple of his churches, he was also the music minister, though his primary emphasis was education. And so we were in a very musical family. And as I grew up, however, I grew up with the music of my peers in the pop culture, and I listened to pop music and rock, and then later began to get an ear more for jazz. And yet I look back upon my childhood. I was in a children's choir. I was in the youth choir. I sang in church. And as I've grown in my sanctification and grown in my understanding of culture and how these things act upon us and the dangers of some of these things, because even pop music, I can find myself at a grocery store humming or even singing the text of a song that I never knew I knew the lyrics of to begin with. And I've got it, this many years later. And it's a scary thing. That text has come back. It lodged itself in such a way. And I remember telling my dad, well, I don't listen to the music, the text anyway. I just like the music. I don't even know what they're saying. Well, I must have understood something, because I can regurgitate these things in the grocery store. And that's a scary thing when you think about it. The more I've understood how powerful music is, and as I've grown and as I've appreciated, I've come to something that I never, ever would have thought I would have realized. And that is, I find the most captivating, the most powerful music that I've ever been moved with is vocal music in a choral setting, but live. You can never experience what I'm talking about in a recording. As great as recordings are to bring that to us, but to experience it in the space with the people, with those instruments that God has given, that He's given all of us those instruments, and one He has not only expected but commanded, but it is a great delight to do so, to sing with. That when you find a choir and you have these number of voices coming together as one voice, but with many textures and different themes and the counterpoint and all of this going, is an incredibly moving thing for me. And that is where I have grown, and it actually has taken me right back to the roots of how my parents raised me in terms of the church choirs, and never would have thought, that would have had that anchor that has pulled me back. And now I see it in a whole different light. I see the praises of God and His commands and the text He gives us, and the doctrine, the teaching. It's more than just the medium now. It becomes an entire package. So I've grown in these things, and at the same time as I've grown, I still listen to certain types of jazz, and there's certain genres of pop that I'm very careful with. But that's a very broad category today, as it was, I think, probably a little more narrowly defined when I was growing up, that I appreciate and will listen to. There are some genres of music, however, that I used to listen to that I look at and I say, no. And so people would question me, well, look, listen to the text. Yeah, the text is okay for that song. But the whole culture that surrounds that right now is not something that is good for me, and it's not something that I don't think is good for anybody.
So the subtext matters, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it does.